Hi, everyone. I'm Fishman Cohen, the chair and co-founder of iRelaunch, and I want to thank the GSV, the ASU GSV organizers for the opportunity to be here today. And I'm thrilled to share the virtual stage with Rich Karlgaard, who's the publisher of Forbes magazine and author of Late Bloomers. And we're going to talk about this topic today. And Rich and I met in person about a year ago when his book came out, and we both shared the stage at my company's iRelaunch Return to Work conference at Stanford University. And I'm featured in the Late Bloomer book myself. So we'll talk about the different definitions of late bloomers, but I want to now turn it over to Rich. If you can introduce yourself and maybe talk about your late bloomer story and what led to you writing the book.
Well, thank you, Carol, and thank you for the sponsors of this tremendous conference, which has been growing in reach and reputation year by year. Well, for a long time, I've always wondered whether I should write a book about late bloomers and tell my own story. I'm very much of a late bloomer. At age 25, despite having gone to a good college, I was completely unable to get my adult life going. I was incapable of holding a job of no greater responsibility than security guard and temporary typist and things like that. In fact, one night when I was a security guard at age 25, 3 years after I graduated from college, I was walking the fence perimeter and it was at night and I heard a dog barking across the way and I swung my flashlight around and there was a Rottweiler snarling and yapping at me. And fortunately, there was a fence that separated us, but it occurred to me there was no fence to separate this thought from intruding on my mind that at age 25, my colleague, professional colleague, was a dog. And it was, I can look back at it with humor, but it wasn't funny at the time. And it wasn't really until I was about 26 or 27 that things began to fall in place and I was ready to move on with an adult life and take on adult responsibilities. So I always wanted there was a chance to tell a story in a way that would be useful. I've lived my whole adult life in Silicon Valley, and what really prompted me to write this book, starting research in around 2015, were stories of horror in two different demographic groups. One story of horror was happening at the high school level, where kids were exhibiting higher degrees of depression, suicidal thoughts, even suicides. Atlantic Monthly, Hannah Rosa came out and visited Palo Alto's two public high schools and a girls' school named Castellea, where there had been 6 suicides, and saw this extraordinary pressure that kids felt to be these super achievers at young ages, that if they were mere B+ students, they were somehow inferior. So there was that pressure to be an early bloomer. And then another New York Times Sunday Magazine story wrote about ageism in Silicon Valley and how somebody in their 40s working for an enterprise software company felt they only had another 5 years to go before they would be of any use in Silicon Valley. And I thought, these are catalysts. These are messages saying you've got to write a book debunking this idea that if we don't bloom early and we don't set our marks in our careers early, that somehow it's all over for us, because that I've just described the majority of us. And if the majority of us are feeling demoralized and depressed, that's a bad thing for the country and the world.
Right. And, at iRelaunch, we work with a population of people who are mid-career, who are on career breaks and then are relaunching their careers. And I experienced this myself because I took an 11-year career break, but it's very common that society attaches so much importance to your whole identity in terms of what you do for work. And you're touching on this at both ends of that spectrum in your introductory comments, that if you become professionally disconnected for an extended period of time, you can experience a diminished sense of self, and it can be very debilitating. And people at mid-career have to figure out what they want to do all over again, sometimes even if they don't take a career break. And I'm just interested in your different definitions of late bloomers and maybe some examples that you would want to share with our audience.
Yeah, one of the things that I was surprised to find out in my 4-year journey of researching and writing this book, it came out in the spring of 2019. But as I said, I started looking into it in 2015, was that there was no accepted definition of late bloomers. And when you saw it in the literature, in psychology, literature or neuroscience literature, it usually was some vague term of disparagement. Somebody was just not getting going. They had no other way to describe it. So I thought, well, this is great because let's propose a couple of the definitions. So I proposed two. One is chronological, and one is more of a spiritual, motivational kind of a definition. The chronological one would be you come into your full capacities and your motivations later than expected. As simple as that. Mm-hmm. And it's contextual to what you do. For instance, Tom Brady, the professional quarterback, is a late bloomer in his field. And you might say, well, how could that be so? He won his first Super Bowl at age 24. But he only started his senior year at the University of Michigan, and he was the 199th player taken in the year 2000 NFL draft. Yeah. He was not a superstar. He began to bloom only in his senior year in college. In the context of professional football, that is a late bloomer. Let's say somebody comes into their own as a really good high frequency, under pressure, highly productive software coder in their 30s. That would be a late bloomer by the fields, by the standards of that field. However, if you became a tenured professor of philosophy and wrote a book that got attention and was discussed at age 35, you'd be an early bloomer. So one is contextual, but it's simply you come into your full capacities and motivations later than is typical in your field. The other one I like a little better, though, it's more motivational and spiritual, and that is, but it's kind of related. You arrive at that intersection in your life where you feel like your native gifts and your deepest sense of mission are coming together, and as a result of those two things coming together, you feel like you're being pulled toward what you were supposed to do, your natural destiny here on Earth. And that's a wonderful thing because then you're not feeling pushed. It's my contention that if you operate under outside expectations and for your whole life you feel pushed by others, you will eventually burn out, you will self-sabotage, you're going to make something bad happen if you allow that to happen. Whereas if you allow yourself to be pulled because you're doing the thing you were meant to do, and there's a mission around it. I like the word mission better than passion, because a mission is a passion you would sacrifice for, but it doesn't even feel like that much of a sacrifice because it feels like you're being pulled toward your destiny. And I think that's the definition of true blooming, and it can happen more than once, certainly as you found it at iRelaunch, where, in your own story, where you bloomed in investment banking quite early and then now bloomed as an entrepreneur and really an evangelist for midlife career reblooming.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea because we see this with our population, that people will say that my career break was actually an opportunity for me to step back and reflect on whether I was even on the right career path to begin with. And I realized that either A, I fell into something, because who knows that much about yourself when you're 22 and you fall into some job by accident sometimes, and then you take another job in the same field, and the next thing you know, that's your career. Or as you're talking about, you're fulfilling someone else's expectations, usually your parents. But that is an opportunity for you to step back and think about, well, what do I actually want to do now? And usually that's happening like in your 30s or 40s or 50s.
Yeah. And even this idea, if we go back to being pushed by other people's expectations and being pushed to go to the most elite school that you can, which, is often the most expensive school out there, which, unless you come from a wealthy family, can be really quite a sacrifice for your family. And why are we at that place right now where people feel that pressured? My contention is the two most lucrative, consistently lucrative parts of the American economy over the last 25 years have been sophisticated finance. And I mean everything from Wall Street to Silicon Valley venture capital to hedge funds,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. And Silicon Valley level technology, particularly around the web and particularly around software. And those two fields really screen for, you know, the 800 math SAT type. And the proxy for the 800 math SAT type is somebody went to Caltech or MIT or a similar school. But here's what's amazing. Fortune, not Forbes, I'll have to give our rival Fortune credit for this. In the year 2017, in their annual Best Places to Work issue, they interviewed a bunch of CEOs of really high-performing companies. Brad Smith, who was then the CEO of Intuit, interviewed the CEO of Genentech, companies like that. What do you most value in your employees? And none of them said IQ, none of them said 800 math SAT, none of them said just laser fast intelligence. The number one word that came up was curiosity, which I found really interesting because I really wanted to like yell out here. And I say, well, come on, you're not recruiting for curiosity. You're recruiting for, you know, did the kid go to an elite school? You know, what were their tests and grades like, et cetera, et cetera. And then 3 years later, you want these high performance, hyper focused kids who put aside their natural curiosity to suddenly develop curiosity. You know, it kind of made me mad. Even though they were saying the right things, it kind of made me mad that, oh yeah, by the way, you know, from age 25 on into your 30s, 40s, and 50s and beyond, the number one thing is curiosity, because curiosity is the locus of all motivation and innovation and self-direction, right?
Yes. You know, what we're seeing, and maybe this is a function of employers shifting over time when they're now looking at recruiting back a mid-career person after a career break, that they do value the mature perspective, the groundedness of the population, the stable life stage, but they also are looking for what a fearlessness of learning, being open and fearless about learning what you don't know. So they would say, you know, it's not like I expect everyone to have a command of all the technologies that we're using right now, but I want to see that they're fearless about learning what they don't know. So that feels linked to curiosity to me.
Yes, I think you're right. And it also, I think the fearlessness also means you're willing to surround yourself with people who are brighter than you are in the areas where they're really bright.
Yeah.
One of the things I was pleased to discover in doing the research for this book was that in 2014 or 2015, a study came out of Harvard and MIT. The researchers were Laura Germain of Harvard and Joshua Hartshorn of MIT, both in the field of neuroscience. And they were both postdocs at Massachusetts General Hospital. And while there, they did this study and asked a simple question: at what age do we cognitively peak? And the answer is really wonderful because it's in accord with what we know about human beings and how we develop over the course of our lives. The answer is, what cognitive ability are you talking about? Because we have many, and if you're talking about that rapid synaptic firing, you know, that makes for the high frequency trader on Wall Street or the software coder under pressure, sure enough, as most people would probably guess, we peak in our 20s at that. But then, number one, when we're off peak in any of these cognitive skills that we have, and I'll name some more in just a second, it's not like we drop off a cliff. It's like we drop off at about 2% per year, you know, and then toward the end of our lives a little faster. So off peak, you know, it's barely noticeable, our decline. Think of it almost as a plateau, you know, more than a decline. But what we gain are all of those. We gain resilience, we gain fearlessness, we gain sort of our aperture grows wider and we're able to see the context of things. We gain, one of my favorite words that I use in the book is a word that we don't use enough in culture, is equanimity, which is the ability to stay calm under pressure. Think about Chesley Sullenberger landing the US Airways flight after the birds went into the engine and And he calculated in his mind he couldn't make it to Teterboro, so he had to land in the Hudson River, and he did, and he got everybody out. He was 58 years old when he did that. Or Tammy Jo Schultz, the Southwest Airlines pilot who an engine blew on the 31,000 feet, and she took it down to 10,000 feet. You know, Tammy was 56. We gain equanimity, our ability to stay calm under pressure. And so that kind of points at where we should go in our career, from specialist to, you know, to more managerial, to finally more consultative and mentoring.
So that equanimity, and also this idea about people being comfortable working with people who are smarter or who have a different perspective than they are, and not getting uncomfortable with that, but really thriving off of that. That takes usually a maturity, or else a certain personality type that maybe you're born with. We see that in a younger person, but normally, I agree with you. You're going to see that with people who have evolved somewhat and gotten to know themselves well.
One of the things that I think about for the back to work market, again, when I wrote Late Bloomers, there were really two audiences. One is for parents of kids and teens and young adults who are worried about the development of their children. And, you know, in a word, I'm telling them to relax, not think about it, but take a deep breath, you know, wind your watch. You've got time, you know, and time is in your favor if you start doing the right things now. But for mid-career people, I really, I feel like I'm on a mission here. I want companies to start thinking about employees, their careers as a career arc rather than up and out. You know, up and out sort of professional partnerships are famous for that. We know how professional partnerships work. You have a handful of partners and you have a big number of associates. The associates work their butts off trying to make partners, so they're working 80 hours a week, and the partners are harvesting a lot of that work. But the partners, you know, by the time they get to be partners, they not only become experts in their field, whether it's law or accounting or whatever, think about the professional partnership, they're at their peak of being able to make important connections and drive new businesses and so forth. So it works, but it only works if the partners leave by age 60 or something like that. The math falls apart. You can't be a partner forever. And unfortunately, that thinking of up and out, you know, has crept into, you know, white collar America, and it really shouldn't. Because what you want, I think, is to acknowledge, look, if somebody is developing and succeeding, they are going to get, in a company, they're going to get better and able to take on more responsibilities. But you're also going to have to look out for the generation below, so you're not driving off your young talent. And for the people who are in the positions of power, many of them secretly would you know, are kind of feeling like they've done it. You know, I can't work these 60 and 70-hour weeks anymore. I can't get on a plane, go visit a customer. Back in the days when we used to get on a plane to visit a customer. And so an arc would be, okay, somewhere in your 50s or 60s, let's just agree you're at the peak. And but don't make this a scary thing. Now let's think about what your career looks like on the back side of the peak. Less pay, you give up your C-suite title, and now maybe you're called mentor or coach or senior advisor. But the good thing is that you can, you know, we only want 30 hours a week from you. We want you primarily mentoring people and offering all the wisdom and connections you have. And let's go out and all have fun and joy, you know, and succeed together. And HR people and legal people tell me that sounds good and is impossible to implement because, you know, a negotiation made in good faith. You know, you're at the peak, we're going to negotiate a lower salary, et cetera, et cetera. Some people will claim they didn't really hear the terms of the negotiation, will come back and charge age discrimination. But in theory, anyway, I think it's a grand idea. And in fact, I think smart law firms and accounting firms are already beginning to do that. You go from partner to of counsel. So you stay involved with the firm.
That's right. And, you know, I am aware, though, that law firms do have these mandatory retirement ages at 65. And it just, you know, the way we live now, it just seems like that is so antiquated. So I'm glad you're hearing that there's starting to be some shifting on that. I'm really curious on the other end of the spectrum for the younger people. You have that whole Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours equals an expert kind of mentality, and how kids can get trained at a young age and then they can become really good at something. And then there was an author his name I'm forgetting, who wrote the book Range, which
David Epstein.
Epstein, which is kind of the opposite thing.
Yes.
Like, try everything when you're younger, and don't spend 10,000 hours or concentrating on one particular focus area. I was wondering where you come out between the two philosophies.
I think Epstein makes the better argument, because I think that Malcolm Gladwell, a lot of these 10,000 hour examples he uses were examples of serendipity. I mean, it was serendipitous that Bill Gates had access to the University of Washington, computers. Just all he had to do was go across Lake Washington, and he was there. Or, some of the other examples, I think, even Malcolm Gladwell admitted the serendipity of hockey players who were born in the first couple months of the year, would be months and months older than their peers. At age 8, that's a big difference, to be that stronger and more mature. And I think Epstein, used the great example of Roger Federer. Didn't specialize in tennis. He played soccer. The late Kobe Bryant was a great soccer player.
Brady also played different sports.
Yeah, right? Brady played different sports.
Yeah.
I think that the again, what I really got angry in the book when I, thinking about why is the SAT so important? Because the two most lucrative fields in the United States, high finance and high tech, want that kind of a person. So there's a great competition. So what are we competing? We're competing to get great SAT scores. So what is this thing called the SAT score? Well, the developer of the SAT score, Carl Brigham, developed it out of Princeton in 1926. And he was this is like the dark story of the SAT test and the American version of the IQ test, is that they were all part of the eugenics movement. I mean, every one of these people. Brigham, in the last years of his life, came to profoundly regret the contributions that he had made to eugenics. He just didn't see the full picture at the time. And so even though it was a pair of FDR liberals who revived the reputation of the SAT, which is already beginning to sink in the 1920s, James Conant, the incoming president, and Henry Chauncey, his dean of admissions, used the SAT as a weapon for a different reason, and that's they were sick and tired of rich white young men, waspish men, graduating from Harvard without even attending classes. So they wanted to introduce this tool of meritocracy. But unfortunately, the thing is tainted. Louis Terman of Stanford imported Alfred Binet's 1905 IQ test in France, which is a simple diagnostic test that Binet developed to determine why 3 to 6 year olds were falling behind in France and thus unable to really get rooted in this universal K-8 education that France is the first country to have. And Terman thought, the IQ test was predictive of a whole, lifetime success, which was debunked by his own Stanford, longitudinal test study of the gifted.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, the roots are bad. And I think particularly, is with these new urgencies of diversity and inclusion, that it's part of the year 2020 story. People need to realize the roots of the SAT and the IQ test in the United States are really pretty poison. And so if we're going to have meritocracy, have it based on something, that was at least a little more inclusive and legitimate than this thing called the IQ test, which morphed directly into the SAT test.
Right, let's just shift gears for a minute and talk about COVID, because that's looming in everyone's minds now. And I'm just wondering, do you see any silver lining from the pandemic for graduating high school students and their parents in this very uncertain and disruptive time?
Sure. the research I did for late bloomers led me to become a huge fan of gap years, taking time out. I mean, you can take a gap year between graduating from high school and going to college. You can take a gap year or two while you're in college.
Yep.
The Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon tradition is a kid goes to BYU, they take 2 years off and go on a mission between their sophomore and junior years. And most of them, when they're on it, Clayton Christensen, whom we both knew, who is a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints and a great professor at Harvard Business School, took his mission in South Korea. And he told me it was tough. And he did not have fun. It's not something that he would have picked to do at all. It was not a vacation. But he came back, and he was 24 years old by the time he graduated from BYU, and then he went off to graduate school and everything else. So I think it toughens people up. I mean, I think now is a great time to think about gap years, because why would you want to pay a Stanford or an Ivy League or even a major public university tuition fee to take classes on Zoom? You can do that on Coursera and a number of other places. So I think it's a great time to take for young people to take gap years and say, look, this is just not a good bargain right now, honest to gosh, and go out and do something, join a Meritech, go out and be a day laborer. I mean, do fun, tough things that sort of give you a broader gauge view of the world. We were talking before the show started about how some countries like Israel and Singapore have pretty good results with mandatory military service. And if the word military kind of catches in your throat, well, then find a substitute.
Yeah.
But the idea of mandatory service, has produced better young adults, where in countries like Israel, Singapore, Sweden, Switzerland, than we have in similarly affluent countries like the US, Great Britain, and so on. And so I think there's a lot of merit, and particularly, who are the perpetrators of most of society's ills, in these affluent countries? They're young men. And a lot of these young men didn't have role models. Maybe they did poorly in school and rebelled, fell in with the wrong crowd. And so there are just any number of reasons why I think we ought to have a serious national discussion about mandatory military or fill in the blank mandatory service.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Talking to people who I know who have kids who have served right out of our equivalent of high school military service in Israel, they have told me that what that does is it kind of breaks up whatever the definition is of what you're supposed to do. There's no lockstep path like we have here, because people come out of the military and then sometimes they travel for a year, or then they take some college here and there, and everyone takes a different path, and no one judges what's the successful path or the unsuccessful path. So I think that's helpful too.
Yeah, and I think it also, there's a lot to be said for mixing up social classes. I think a number of studies have shown that college kids today are really short on empathy. And it doesn't surprise me at all that they're short on empathy, because for years and years, they've been a dog-eat-dog, competitive world where they're competing for SAT scores, for admissions into elite universities and so on. And, and the advantages go to educated upper middle class families and wealthier ones too. And so the empathy, anybody who knows me, knows that I am not high on social engineering. I work for Forbes, for crying out loud. I lean more in that direction. But to get people exposed to different classes, different economic classes, as the military does, I think would be of enormously sort of good knockoff effect if we had that.
Switching now to, let's say, parents with school-age children, and also those who are a little further along, maybe mid-career, any comments on the economic impact of COVID on either of those groups, and especially the people, namely the women, who are trying to manage, at-home education right now for their kids and hold down their jobs, and are seriously thinking about, do I take a career break now because something's got to give?
Well, for such women are heroes, and would be, I wouldn't dare offer women who are doing that any kind of advice. I'm just not in a position to be able to do that credibly. But I do think that we're doing a poor job in this country of recognizing the dilemma that such people are in. We know, even if we step back and we don't look at any particular group, we know that 25 to 50% of Americans are struggling with some kind of a low-grade depression right now. A quarter to half of adults, low-grade depression. It isn't any better among teens either. And if you have a quarter to half people are suffering low-grade depression, you're going to have some, high single-digit percentage of people who are really, really in trouble. You say, are there any silver linings? I think one silver lining that I'm seeing, and I hope this isn't just my confirmation bias, but I think the CEOs that are emerging now who are really effective are the ones that have a really strong empathetic quotient, a sense of real that, they really impart their employees that we're trying to do some good in the world. And yes, we have to make a profit because that's our ticket to continue to stay in business, invest in our future, and continue to provide good. And I think, I was thinking about the style of sort of the creative jerk style of CEOs that became legendary here in Silicon Valley. Steve Jobs, brilliant man. Net, people will be writing about that guy centuries from now as a net, he was a contributor, but there was a rough edge that left a lot of damage along the way. Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber, less of a contributor than Steve Jobs, more of a jerk even. And those sort of became celebrated by Silicon Valley and the high tester. And they be a jerk, but there are jerk, a venture capitalist might tell you. What I'm seeing now is when you look at, one of the best CEOs in the world who's not a founder is Satya Nadella. One of the best CEOs in the world who is a founder, but still has to prove himself, but has certainly done a great job so far, Eric Yuan of Zoom, and or Lisa Su of AMD, who's just added 20x market value to AMD that was left for dead just 5 years ago. And these are quiet, authentic, rock solid people. And I think, what does that have to do with COVID? Well, one of the top jobs of the CEO today, and I don't think this goes away, because we're not going back to complete, everybody's going to work at the office. We're going back to some hybrid model, I'm convinced. But when everybody's working at home, you've got to hold your corporate culture together. If 25 to 50% of your employees are suffering some low-grade depression, and their productivity might be trending downward, but not so dramatically you don't see it, that becomes a real problem for your company. And if your best people are leaving, that becomes a problem. How do you get across what kind of a company are, what we stand for? These are the values we stand for. This is what we do. This is what we will not do under any circumstances. And oh, by the way, since the death of George Floyd, the silver lining to that awful event is that diversity and inclusion has been raised as a more urgent issue in companies. And so now you add that, and a jerk can't lead that kind of a revolution. Even a basically good guy, still has to walk the walk. I think Mark Benioff is basically a good person. I've interviewed him multiple times. He's done a fabulous job at Salesforce. He made a mistake though. He went all in for the kind of newly politically correct stakeholder capitalism. Fine as far as it goes. And then they blew their numbers away. And on August 25th, their stock surged because they had a record quarter. And on August 26th, they laid off 1,000 people. So years of, building the reputation of the company to be a stakeholder-friendly company was undone a bit simply by not walking the walk. I forgive Mark. I mean, compared to some of these jerks out there, I know he's a fundamentally good guy, and I know they'll never make that mistake again. But it goes to show you today, in COVID, and then the political environment, everybody's just tighter than a rubber band anyway. It's the leader like a Satya Nadella or an Eric Yuan. The values of Zoom, when I interviewed them a couple weeks ago, their corporate strategy boils down to one word: happiness. Make customers happy, make employees happy. That's your strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Their core value is care. Let's care for everybody and we'll have a better shot at making them happy. That's it. That's it. People can get that, but he delivers it so authentically, and he doesn't trip himself up with an act of hypocrisy. So I think that could be a silver lining, Carol.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Something you said about the depression levels, I'm trying to tie this back now to late bloomers. I'm wondering if you did any sort of an examination of the relationship between mental health or cycles of mental healthiness and different periods in people's lives when they were maybe just about to bloom, but it was delayed, or a rebloomer. Any commentary on that piece of it?
Sure. I think late bloomers in society, because we so celebrate early bloomers, I think late bloomers, whether they're late bloomers, people who haven't bloomed at all, they feel they haven't bloomed at all and they're in high school and college, or they're in their early adulthood, or mid-career people who maybe had a period of blooming and now feel something has gone wrong and things aren't clicking and they feel the need to bloom again. These are people who have quite a bit of self-doubt. And so I wrote a chapter on self-doubt, again, a lot of research. And it's so important, if you're that kind of person and self-doubt is stopping you, to number one, realize that your self-worth is not the same as your self-doubt. Your self-worth is inherent. If you have a religious faith, then you have the faith that you were meant to be here. And that alone gives you this incredible self-worth. But even if you're agnostic, accept that you have self-worth. Self-doubt, then, if you can separate self-doubt from self-worth, self-doubt is simply information. I got this insight from talking to one of the most remarkable women that I interviewed in the book. Oh God, help me with the name. She's a Carol also. And her book is Carol Dweck.
Yeah.
And Mindset.
Yeah.
And Carol Dweck, who wrote Mindset when she was a professor at Columbia, but now she's been at Stanford for a while.
Yeah.
And we got to talking about self-doubt. And she said she sees a lot of self-doubt among her incoming freshmen. She teaches a freshman psychology class at Stanford because these kids have been operating under this crucible of expectations that's really been kind of tough for them. And they all feel like imposters and they all suffer self-doubt. So she said, self-doubt is just information. Think of self-doubt as an annoying relative who shows up at always the wrong time to needle you or to deliver bad information. But you kind of like them. You don't want to crush them or kill them. You invite them, you say what you have to say, you again, tell me what you have to tell me, and then go sit down. And then so your self-doubt, well, what is it telling me? Maybe it's telling me I didn't prepare enough. Maybe it's telling me I need a partner in this project. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's telling me I need more sleep or exercise, or I have to take care of myself better. Maybe it's telling me I need a gap year or a break. It's not telling me that you're a worthless human being, because it doesn't have the power to tell you that. And that's why it's so important to separate those two things. So the second half of my book, Late Bloomers, is full of a lot of stuff that is provably efficacious. It's been provable in numerous psychological experiments, including self-doubt, how we talk to each other, how you talk to yourself, turns out to be really important.
Yeah, negative self-talk, huge driver of depression. What about the role of shame, especially in when you're surrounded by high performers?
Well, that's a good one. I didn't directly address shame. I would put it in the category of self-doubt. I'd also put it into, there's a chapter, Hannah, on culture and how sometimes we need to repot. Sometimes we get into a rut where the people that we're hanging out with are not really our true friends. And if they were under, if they were given truth serum, might say, we really don't want you to bloom, because then you're leaving, then you're leaving the crab pot, the crab pot idea that crabs will try to drag down a crab that's trying to leave the pot. Shame goes to self-worth. Shame, I think, I'm speculating here because I didn't directly look into shame, but I would say shame is what happens when you let self-doubt undermine your self-worth. They simply aren't the same thing. You have to accept that you have inherent self-worth, and then you begin to look at self-doubt as, okay, it's tactical information. It's not what I wanted to hear. If somebody criticizes you at work, take it as, just let it roll off you, but take the informational value of it. And usually there's some informational value that you don't want to hear at that point. But that's the habit that we have to learn to have. And it's the habit that people who are able to bloom more than once have learned to develop.
We're wrapping up now. We're actually coming to the end of the session. So I wanted to know, as we wrap up, are there any parting words or topics that we didn't cover that you want to make any comments on?
Well, I'll give just a little commercial pitch. Late Bloomers is coming out as a paperback in January with a different cover. It's got a blue cover with a tortoise and a hare, and so look for it then. But if there's anybody that who seems stuck, and you're not quite ready to buy the book, go to Amazon. It's been reviewed about 140 times, and so you can get a sense of what the book's about. And there's some good advice that comes out of there. People get stuck. I'll end a story on the great baseball pitcher, Sandy Koufax.
Okay.
He was sort of a late bloomer in his own way. We often called one of the best pitchers in the history of Major League Baseball. He peaked, great pitcher, best pitcher in the 1960s, left-hander. He was Jewish. There haven't been a lot of Jewish baseball stars other than Hank Greenberg and Sandy Koufax, but he was absolutely fantastic. When I studied his life, he played 12 years in the majors, and the first 6 years in the majors were kind of a bust. And he almost hung it up after the 1961 season. And what was happening is that he was trying too hard. And finally, he shows up at spring training in 1962. And one of the catchers on the team said, Sandy, stop trying to throw so hard. Stop trying to throw so hard. Relax. You have what it takes. And I think, how many people are like that? All they need is that one trusted person who say, if you just did this one thing, you will bloom. And that's what makes me so eternally hopeful about the human condition, is we're often just short of that one.